Hey friends, welcome back to the Journal Feed. My name is Nick Zelt, and this is the only place where I get to spoon feed you guys the latest and greatest of emergency medicine. This is the audio version of the past week summaries, which this week were brought to you by our authors Hunter Perala, Kitan Patel, Millie Kassé, Jason Lesnick, Samuel Rouleau, Aaron Lacey, and Clay Smith. Okay, let's get straight into the first article, which was titled An Analysis of Potential Cervical Spine Clearance in Children with Computed Tomography Alone, out of the Journal of Trauma and Acute Care Surgery. Now, in adults, we've really gone the way of that if you have a completely normal CT, you can clear that C-spine, even in an obtunded patient. This is really convenient for emergency departments, and I think it's a great thing. However, in children, we haven't quite gotten that far. Children have a lot higher chance of having other injuries despite not having a bony injury. They're much higher risk for skywara and things like that. And so it hasn't gone that way for kids. Not yet, anyways. But these days, with modern CT scanners, which are getting better and better all the time, perhaps we've finally gotten there. CTs are really good tools. They're not as good as MRIs, but MRIs are hard to get. They take a long time. You often need to sedate children. It would be great if a CT was really good enough to do the job, especially since these kids are going to get CTs anyways in these cases because they're a lot faster and are a lot better for critical management of sick kids if you're suspecting a C-spine injury. This was a retrospective cohort study which examined whether CT alone was reliable to clear the pediatric cervical spine after trauma. This is a big registry data study from 23 hospitals, 14,000 CT scans, and cervical spine injuries in just 0.8% of cases. They demonstrated that CTs were really quite sensitive, 96%, with 100% negative predictive value. After they reviewed the cases that had been missed by CT, they saw that actually there were signs of abnormalities there. And thus, after kind of going back and relooking at those scans, it seems that CTs were good enough. Humans were the problem that was missing out here. It's us that missed those findings the first time. But the CTs did a good job. There was always evidence of something abnormal if there was something abnormal or dangerous. Now, this is only a retrospective trial, and it relies on the fact that these scans were read by pediatric radiologists who do this kind of thing regularly. I think that's something that can't be understated in this case. You really need experts to look at these CT scans. And even in that case, some of these C-spine injuries were missed, although there were findings present. Now, this is still kind of early data on this sort of thing, but I expect more studies to say similarly in the future. So you can feel really quite reassured if your CT scan is truly completely normal. In a spoonful, this large retrospective study supports the clearance of pediatric C-spines with just a CT, provided that the scan is read by a specialist and it's a modern scanner. Okay, let's skip straight over to the fifth article. Titled Airway Management in Trauma Patients with Active Hemorrhage, Does Intubation Location Matter? A nationwide retrospective cohort study out of the American Journal of Emergency Medicine. Now, we've talked about this a few times before on the Journal Feed, which is about where you want to intubate trauma patients. Back in 2023, we covered an article which seemed to show that there was an association between intubating in the emergency department and a worse mortality. So if you have a trauma patient, they are likely better off being intubated in the operating room. That was the overall message from that study. Now, just a little while ago this year, we covered another article which did not find that and did not find a significant association between the two. And that seemed to imply that whether you intubate in the emergency room or the operating room, they were equal. Now, this is for really sick trauma patients who required pretty much immediate hemorrhage control. In the first article I mentioned that we covered in 2023, they excluded patients who had an immediate indication for intubation, which makes sense. If you have to intubate, then obviously you have to intubate. From the second article I just mentioned from earlier this year, they did not make that exclusion. Now, from this article that we're covering today, it's actually from the same cohort of patients, a slightly larger date range, but the same cohort of patients as the second study, which found no significant difference. The difference between this study and that study from earlier this year is that, again, they excluded patients with an immediate indication for intubation. Because, obviously, if you have to intubate, you have to intubate. However, if you do not have to intubate, then they seem to find a 5 times higher odds of mortality if you intubated in the emergency department. So if you have a patient who is unfortunately bleeding to death, but is protecting their airway, they might be better off being intubated in the operating room. And this makes sense. I support this generally. This really goes towards the sort of CAB approach to managing hemorrhage. You want to resuscitate these patients as much as possible before you put a plastic tube between their vocal cords. And if that means that they get the most resuscitation possible by only being intubated in the operating room, then power to it. Sure, it's going to make some people a little bit anxious that what if something changes? What if something happens in the elevator or something like that? But, I don't know. These numbers seem fairly convincing. I think we'd need an RCT for this sort of thing to really get to the bottom of it, but it's going to be a hard study to do, and it's going to be difficult to recruit the kind of numbers that you'd like to see. However, if there truly is a 5-fold increase in mortality, then maybe we don't have to power that study that much. All this makes sense to me. Personally, I advocate for only the appropriate treatments at the appropriate times. So if my patient doesn't need to be intubated, then really I like to focus on resuscitating them. That means getting blood into those patients for the most part, and having as few delays as humanly possible between getting that patient to the OR. Because what is really going to save them is definitive hemorrhage control. In a spoonful, this very large trauma registry study doubles down on that ED intubations are dangerous for trauma patients, and that waiting for the OR is likely the best thing to do if your patient does not have an immediate indication for intubation. Okay, that's all the articles from this past week. Let's do a quick review of everything we talked about. From the first article, literature to support C-spine clearance in pediatrics after simply one CT scan is fairly good, assuming that it was read by a specialist and it was a modern CT scanner. And then from the fifth article, remember, trauma means a CAB approach. So resuscitate before the airway if possible, even if that means that you don't get to intubate in the emergency department and that patient waits for the OR. While being resuscitated as much as possible, I might add. If you were hearing this right now, then you are not a part of the members feed, and so you missed 3 articles that we covered only on the members feed. What did you miss out on? Well, there's some new criteria to screen for blunt cerebrovascular injuries in pediatrics. We looked at a machine learning algorithm which analyzed when is a better time to start vasopressin, and then what is the best blood pressure to have post-ROSC if you're on a helicopter. Links to all the original studies can be found at journalfeed.org, or just follow the links in your show notes. Our goal here is for you to read less, learn more, or save lives, one spoonful at a time. Thank you.